And really, we're just more or less challenging ourselves to find other things that people don't expect us to find. You know, we're transportation buyers, you know, motorcycles, cars, anything related to that.
There's something about a man who builds his life around forgotten things that makes you wonder, quietly, what he might be hiding about his own. Mike Wolfe didn't just find old objects. He found meaning in them, rusted motorcycles left to rot in somebody's field, hand-painted signs faded by decades of sun. Barns packed floor to ceiling with the kind of history that most people drive right past without a second thought. He walked into strangers' lives carrying nothing but curiosity and a warm smile, and somehow, almost instantly, America decided it trusted him. For years, he was the man who made ordinary people feel like their memories mattered. The man who saw treasure where the rest of the world saw trash. But here's what nobody talks about. The people who spend their whole lives searching through other people's stories, they don't always spend that same time looking at their own. 30 years is a long time. Long enough to build something that feels unbreakable. Long enough to quietly lose things, piece by piece, behind closed doors far from any camera. Long enough for a carefully held image to develop cracks that no television edit can smooth over. What America saw was the show, the finds, the handshakes, the easy laugh. What America didn't see was everything happening the moment the cameras stopped rolling. This is not a story built on scandal. Mike Wolfe is not a villain in this telling, but it is a true story. And true stories carry weight that polished ones never do. They have shadows, they have silences. They have moments that refuse to be edited out no matter how much anyone might wish they could be. Over the past several years, pieces of his life that were never meant to reach the public have quietly, steadily made their way into the light. A divorce. A friendship that fractured in ways that visibly still carry pain. A business empire navigating pressure it wasn't built to withstand. And a version of Mike Wolfe that is far more complicated, far more textured, and ultimately far more human than anything that ever aired on the History Channel. This is that story. To understand how something changes, you first have to understand what it was before the change came. Mike Wolfe didn't fall into fame the way some people do, by accident, by luck, by being in the right room at the right moment. He moved toward it deliberately, slowly, over years. But what he was really chasing wasn't celebrity, it was something harder to name: a feeling. The feeling of holding something real in a world that kept moving faster, throwing things away faster, forgetting faster than anyone could keep up with. He grew up in Iowa, a quiet state. A quiet kind of childhood. Nothing about it suggested that he would one day become a household name, that strangers would drive hours just to stand inside a shop he built, that his face would become shorthand for a particular kind of American nostalgia. But even as a young boy, before any of that was imaginable, he was already doing the thing that would define him: pulling objects out of the dirt. Wandering through fields looking for pieces of something older than himself. Coming home with rusted, unidentifiable things, eyes already wide with the story he'd invented around them. His mother spoke about it later, how he never just found junk, he found meaning. Every broken thing had a life before it broke, and he wanted to know what that life looked like. That instinct grew with him. It didn't fade the way childhood passions often do. By the time he was in his 20s, he had done something that very few people manage. He had turned a feeling into a livelihood. Antique archaeology, his shop in LeClaire, Iowa, became something more than a place to buy old things. It became a philosophy made physical. A statement that value isn't printed on a sticker or decided by a market, it's discovered. It lives in the worn edges, in the dents and scratches, in everything that time has touched. And then the show arrived, and everything scaled up in ways even he probably didn't fully anticipate. American Pickers premiered on the History Channel in January of 2010, and within weeks, it wasn't just popular, it was a phenomenon. Millions of people who had never once thought about antiques, who had never considered walking into a barn looking for treasure, found themselves unable to look away. And it wasn't really about the objects, although the objects were fascinating enough. It was about the people, the conversations. The way Mike Wolfe could walk into a stranger's cluttered, dusty world and make them feel within minutes that someone genuinely cared about what they'd spent a lifetime keeping. That's not something you teach. It's not something a camera crew creates. It either comes through or it doesn't. For most of the decade that followed, life seemed to match the image perfectly. He married Jodie Feith in 2012, a woman who had walked beside him through much of the journey before the cameras ever arrived. They had a daughter together, Charlie, a name he says with a different softness than he says almost anything else. The antique archaeology brand grew to Nashville, Books came. Guest appearances followed. Awards, recognition, a cultural footprint that extended well beyond anything the antique world had ever produced before. From the outside, it looked like a life assembled with rare care, something that had survived every test like the best finds always do. But surviving something and moving through it easily, those are never quite the same thing. And no amount of intention protects a person from everything that life eventually decides to send their way. For most of the people who loved American Pickers, the show was the complete picture. That's not a criticism, it's just the nature of television. You get what the frame allows. And what the frame showed year after year was genuinely warm, genuinely real, and genuinely earned. At its peak, the show was pulling in millions of viewers per episode. It was the kind of television that felt safe in a way very little does anymore. You could watch it with your grandmother. You could watch it with young children. You could put it on early on a Saturday morning and feel, for an hour, that the world was a place full of interesting people and beautiful forgotten things. At the center of all of it was a dynamic that no writer's room could have invented. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz didn't meet because of a television show. They knew each other long before a single producer made a single phone call. They had picked together, argued together about value and history and what made something worth preserving. They had built a shared language around the work that went back years before any camera ever pointed at either of them. And when that history was placed inside a television format, the result was a chemistry so natural it almost felt unfair. The banter was real. The disagreements were real. The ribbing was relentless and warm in equal measure. Viewers felt it, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what they were responding to. They weren't just watching two men look at old things. They were watching a genuine friendship operate in real time, and that is rare enough to be worth paying attention to. Around them, the world Mike had built continued to expand. The LeClaire shop became a destination, not in the casual sense, but in the deliberate plan your route, drive across state lines sense. People who had never particularly cared about antiques made the trip just to walk through the space, to stand in the rooms they'd seen on their screens, to feel some physical proximity to a world they'd come to care about through a television set. Nashville followed with the same careful attention, the same visual warmth. He used the platform generously. There were preservation efforts he championed publicly, craftsmanship traditions he used his visibility to spotlight. Conversations about what it costs a culture when it stops paying attention to what it's made. He spoke about the work not as a business strategy but as something closer to a responsibility. This was the Mike Wolfe that America knew, and none of it was performance. Every part of it was genuine. But there is always a difference between what is real and what is complete. And beneath everything that looked solid and permanent, something was quietly beginning to move. The first sign that something had shifted didn't come from Mike at all. It came from Frank. In 2021, Frank Fritz did not return for the new season of the show. The official announcement was brief. The explanation offered to the public was minimal. And Mike's own comments on the matter, while measured and not unkind, carried a distance that felt deliberate to anyone listening carefully. There was care in his words, but there was also a boundary, a line he was not stepping across no matter how many questions pressed up against it. What came out gradually, through reporting and through Frank's own direct statements, was that the friendship had fractured in a way that went beyond scheduling difficulties or health complications. Frank said publicly, not through a spokesperson, not through a carefully worded statement, but in his own voice, in his own words, that the two men had not spoken in a significant period of time. That the warmth the public had watched for over a decade had cooled, privately, in ways that nobody on the outside had been allowed to see. According to his own account, the breakdown was real and it still carried pain. That landed hard for a lot of people, because the friendship wasn't just a subplot in the show, it was load-bearing. It was part of what made the whole thing feel authentic. And when it became clear that the friendship, at least the version that had existed, was no longer intact, something in the show's mythology cracked open in a way that couldn't be quietly sealed back up. Mike spoke carefully. He expressed genuine concern for Frank's well-being in his public comments. But he didn't attempt to rebuild the narrative, didn't reach for the kind of reconciling statement that public figures often manufacture to calm a story down. Some people read that restraint as dignity. Others read it as confirmation that the distance between them was exactly as wide as it appeared. Then came something even more personal. Mike and Jody Wolfe, married for close to 9 years, together for far longer than that, had filed for divorce. It didn't arrive with drama, no public accusations. No competing statements released through lawyers to the press. According to reports, the proceedings moved forward without the kind of spectacle that so often surrounds the private lives of people who live in public. But the confirmation was real. And it quietly dismantled a picture of his personal life that a lot of people had held for years without ever being asked to question it. A friendship fractured, a marriage ending. These things never arrive all at once. They build slowly across years, across small moments and long silences and decisions made in private that nobody outside the door ever witnesses. What they pointed to together, in such a compressed period of time, was a season of his life that was far heavier than anything his public presence ever let on. There is a particular kind of pressure that builds around a person when they become beloved. It isn't violent pressure, it doesn't announce itself, but it is constant. When people project a wholesome image onto you, a trustworthy image, a warm and uncomplicated image, the labor of maintaining that projection becomes relentless in its own quiet way. You lose the right to have a bad day where it shows. You lose the freedom to be complicated without it being read as contradiction. You lose the simple, ordinary human ability to be a work in progress without someone deciding that means the whole thing was a lie. Mike Wolfe lived inside that pressure for over a decade. What various reports and interviews from this period began to reveal was a portrait of a man managing far more than what the cameras ever captured. The show itself was a significant logistical undertaking, season after season. The stores required constant attention, constant curation, constant care. The public persona demanded consistency regardless of what was happening privately. Personal relationships were under strain. And the franchise, which had always been built around the particular chemistry of two specific people, was now asking a question that nobody had thought to prepare an answer for. Could it still be itself with only one of them? The show continued. Danielle Colby, who had always been a vital part of its texture and warmth, remained. New pickers were introduced and given space to find their footing. Mike stayed present, stayed engaged, showed up every time he was supposed to show up. But the audience that had grown up with the original dynamic felt the difference without always being able to name it. Something in the rhythm had changed. The effortlessness that had once been the show's greatest quality now required effort that was occasionally visible. Questions began to surface carefully in murmurs rather than headlines about the business architecture behind the brand, about licensing arrangements, about the relationship between what the show presented as the world of antique picking and the actual complicated business of running it at scale. None of those questions had simple answers. And in the space created by that absence of clarity, speculation moved in as it always does. Meanwhile, Danielle was navigating her own very public transitions, health challenges. Personal changes she spoke about with a directness and vulnerability that stood in quiet contrast to the more guarded posture of the show itself. Her openness felt human, and somehow that made the surrounding silence feel heavier by comparison. What was coming into focus, slowly and without drama, was a picture of something built with great love beginning to transform. And transformation, even necessary transformation, even healthy transformation, it almost always carries grief alongside it. There is a moment in the arc of nearly every public figure's story where the performance and the actual person begin to diverge. It doesn't always happen because of a single dramatic event. It rarely does. It happens the way most real things happen, gradually through accumulation. The person grows in ways the frame can't hold, or they hurt in ways the frame won't show. Or they simply change, as human beings inevitably do, and the version of them that exists in the public imagination falls further and further behind the person they actually are. When that divergence becomes visible, the public response is almost never simple. Some people feel protective, some feel a complicated sense of loss. Some feel irrationally but genuinely that they were misled, even when no lie was ever actually told. What was becoming clear about Mike Wolfe in this chapter of his life was the full, unmanageable weight of being human inside an institution. Because that is what he had become, not merely a television personality, but something closer to an institution. American Pickers had grown into a piece of American culture. The stores had become destinations for people across the country. His books sat on shelves in homes he would never visit. His name and his philosophy and his particular way of seeing the world had grown into something that extended far beyond the reach of any one person. And yet, he remained exactly one person. The divorce from Jody proceeded, according to reports, without the public theater that so often surrounds these situations when they involve famous people. No warring statements. No dramatic court appearances covered by cameras. The legal process moved forward with a quietness that was either a reflection of mutual respect or a reflection of just how well both of them understood the weight of living under public attention. Most likely it was something of both. What Mike did through all of it was continue. He kept picking, he kept showing up. He kept posting, kept engaging, kept letting his love for old things and found things and forgotten things remain visible to the people who followed him. To anyone observing casually, the surface looked largely unchanged. But underneath that surface, the real story was far richer and far more difficult than anything visible from the outside. A long friendship broken in ways that still hadn't healed, a marriage finished, a franchise in the middle of becoming something different from what it had been. All of it happening at once, all of it private, all of it carried by someone who had built his entire public identity around the idea of being an open book. He had always believed that the most valuable things are the ones that have survived difficulty, that wear and age and damage don't diminish an object's worth, they prove it. They tell you it's real, that it has lasted, that it means something. Perhaps quietly, he had begun to apply that same understanding to himself. The Mike Wolfe who exists today is not the man who stood grinning in someone's barn in 2010, holding a vintage motorcycle part above his head like he'd pulled gold from the earth. That man is still in there. You can still find him in the smile, in the way his eyes move when he's looking at something old and beautiful and overlooked. But there is more around it now. A kind of quietness that wasn't there before. The particular depth that only comes from having been through things that didn't make the final cut. He has spoken in recent years with careful, measured honesty about slowing down, about being more deliberate, about paying attention to the things that actually matter when the noise gets stripped away. He speaks about his daughter Charlie with a softness that has nothing to do with public image and everything to do with love. That kind of tenderness can't be performed. You can hear the difference. He has also spoken about Frank, in the way that people speak about the most complicated relationships in their lives, carefully, with neither hostility nor false warmth. According to various reports, there were gestures toward reconnection during this period, small movements made across the distance between them. And then in 2022, Frank suffered a serious stroke, which brought the fractured friendship back into the public conversation with a kind of urgency and grief that felt different from anything that had come before it. No dramatic reunion was arranged. No statement was released to put a neat conclusion on the story. But people who have paid close attention to how Mike speaks, in interviews on his platforms, in the margins of conversations that aren't quite about this, have noted a shift in how he talks about the people who shaped him. There is gratitude there, and beneath the gratitude, something quieter that sounds very much like mourning. The show continues, not the cultural force it once was, perhaps, but still present. Still finding stories, still doing the exact thing it was built to do, reminding people, week after week, that value doesn't announce itself. It waits. It hides in plain sight inside places that most people have already decided aren't worth their time. Beyond the show, new chapters are being written in quieter spaces. Preservation work. Collaborations with craftspeople who are keeping old skills alive. A focus on what lasts and why, and what it means to care about legacy in a world that moves the way this one does. What is emerging slowly and without fanfare is the portrait of a man who had something extraordinary, lost pieces of it in ways he didn't plan for, and is now doing the patient, private work of figuring out what the next version of his life looks like. Not loudly, not for an audience, just steadily, the way people do when they're finally doing it for themselves. There is something quietly instructive about a story like this one. Not because it contains a scandal that demands resolution, not because it builds toward a neat moment of triumph or a clean moment of tragedy, but because it is so deeply, unmistakably recognizable. A person builds something with great care and great love. Life, which has never once agreed to follow a plan, intervenes. Things that seemed permanent turn out not to be. And the person at the center of it all has to make a decision, probably many decisions made slowly over time, about what to carry forward and what to finally allow themselves to set down. Mike Wolfe spent 30 years telling other people's stories through the objects they left behind. A rusted tin sign that once hung outside a filling station in a town that no longer exists. A motorcycle that sat quietly in a barn for 4 decades, waiting for someone to remember it deserved better. A hand-painted wooden toy, worn smooth from years of small hands, that some child loved without reservation a century ago, that someone else held onto for reasons they probably couldn't fully explain. Every one of those objects was, at one point in time, someone's whole world, and then it wasn't. And then it became something else entirely. A piece of history, a found treasure, a story carried inside a television screen into millions of homes. Maybe he has come to understand his own life through the same kind of lens. Not as a straight line that moves cleanly from one achievement to the next, but as a collection. A series of objects, moments, relationships, decisions, losses, each one carrying its own particular weight. Each one part of a larger arrangement that doesn't always reveal its meaning until you step back from it and give it space and time and quiet. The friendship with Frank, the marriage to Jody, the show and what it grew into and what it became without the people it started with. The image built slowly and genuinely, then complicated by the fact that images can never fully contain a human life. All of it was real. All of it mattered. All of it was changed by time, the way everything that matters always is. There are questions that remain open. Questions about how the friendship between Mike and Frank truly came apart, and whether the space between them ever meaningfully closed. Questions about what the private years of his marriage looked like when no camera was present. When it was just two people trying to live inside a life that had grown very large and very complicated around them. Questions about what the years ahead hold, and whether they will carry the same weight and meaning as the 30 that came before. Those questions may never receive the kind of clear, definitive answers that feel satisfying, and maybe that is something worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Not everything that matters gets resolved. Not every story earns a clean ending. Some of the most important things in a life just become part of it, woven into the texture of who a person is, visible to anyone willing to look closely enough. What can be said with genuine confidence is this. The man who spent 3 decades looking for value inside forgotten things is now doing something more personal than any pick he has ever made. He is looking for what still holds in his own life, what still carries meaning, what is worth the effort of carrying forward into whatever is coming next. That is not a story about failure. It is not a cautionary tale. It is not a scandal dressed up as a documentary. It is simply a story about a real person, complicated in the way that real people always are. Marked by time the way everything that lasts always is. Still moving forward, quietly and without announcement, in a world that has never once stopped asking him to be something simpler than he actually is. If this story stayed with you, if something in it made you think about the people we watch, the lives we imagine for them, and what it truly means to build something that lasts, we would love to hear from you in the comments below. What part of Mike Wolfe's journey felt most human to you? What stayed with you after the story ended? If you believe there is still room in this world for storytelling that goes deeper than the surface, that takes its time and treats real lives with real care, then stay with us. Subscribe, and we will keep bringing you the stories that deserve more than a headline.